I'm Ben Watson, and welcome to Defense One Radio.
The United States is under attack, sir.
So it's a coin toss? That's what $50 billion buys us?
We're talking about hitting a bullet with a bullet.
Hello? Hello, can anyone hear me?
Mr. President, let's get you up to speed.
That is a clip from the recent suspense thriller A House of Dynamite from director Kathryn Bigelow. It's a film about an unattributed and possibly nuclear-armed missile that's headed for the United States, and how the country's military and political leaders missed its launch and now have just minutes to respond. Those leaders include a general who wants to attack America's biggest nuclear-armed enemies while that missile is still up in the air. And I should point out that the United States military took the unusual step of actually responding to this movie, with the Missile Defense Agency telling the outlet Bloomberg that the country's missile defense systems are more accurate and effective than this film portrays. So we're going to talk about all that today. Jon Wolfsthal is the Director of Global Risk at the Federation of American Scientists. He's previously served as Special Assistant to the President and Senior Director at the National Security Council, where he was responsible for things like nuclear arms control and policy under President Obama. He recently authored a commentary for Defense One about U.S. nuclear command and control processes, a topic that's central to the movie A House of Dynamite. And heads up for listeners, there may be spoilers in this episode, so do yourself a favor and watch the movie first, please. Jon Wolfsthal, welcome to Defense One Radio.
Thank you, gentlemen, for having me.
Very good. We're, of course, also joined by my Defense One colleagues, Science and Technology Editor Patrick Tucker, as well as Air and Space Warfare reporter Tom Novelli. Tom attended a special screening of the film with director Kathryn Bigelow just yesterday in Washington. Tom and Patrick, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, good to see you.
Thanks so much. Glad to be back.
So it's not often we get to talk about a movie, so I embrace these kind of opportunities. So John, I want to start with you, because as you write in your essay for Defense One, you said, overall, I liked the movie because it gets so many things right. Yet at the same time, this is not a movie for experts and nuclear wonks to love because it gets so many other things wrong. All right, so to begin, what sort of things did you see that you liked and that they got right? And next we can, pivot to where things maybe went off the rails a bit in terms of deviating from reality.
Great. I think it's always best to start with the positive and then you can nitpick later. I've been working on nuclear weapons policy professionally for 35 years in Washington. And, mostly when you are at a party and you tell people that you're an expert on nuclear weapons, they look over your shoulder for the other person so they can walk away. But I do get a lot of questions about how does this actually work? And, what's it like to work in the White House? And, when you do these nuclear simulations, what does the black book look like? And this movie gets a lot of those details really, really right. As I say in the piece, the nuclear handbook, the actual black binder that they hand to the president in a simulation, or God forbid, in a crisis, to choose nuclear strike options, looks exactly like the real nuclear handbook. So the people doing the movie, Bigelow and the advisors, really did their homework. What does the situation room look like? What do the phones in the situation room look like? If you're moving from the Pentagon to another location, how would you get there, and what would that entourage be? So the feel and the look of the movie really is spot on, and I think that helps for at least people like me that have had the opportunity to live that. Makes the movie feel comfortable and authentic, even if it falls short on some of the technical details for the drama that they obviously need to create for a movie.
Now, yeah, that was great. There was a familiarity to it, and I, of course, have never been to the level of detail that you have, but I appreciated it, having been through the Pentagon and various places within the military in my time. There was an authenticity there I did enjoy or appreciate, like you said.
For people that have worked in the Pentagon, if you've ever been in the SecDef office, I mean, they recreated the secretary's office or they got access to it for the movie, because that's exactly what it looks like, down to where the desk is located and the windows. So yeah, it really is spot on. They need to create drama and they need to create gaps. And so there are a couple of things that really just didn't work for me. So for example, at one point they have the Russian foreign minister on the phone in the situation room and they want to connect him to the president. And they say, well, we can't do that because the president's on a secure line. We can't patch him in. The people in the situation room have thought about how could they patch in different lines from different locations, and they can make that stuff work. So, there are just some technical flaws that they inserted in order to make things more dramatic. Where I think there also was a breakdown, and as I say in the piece, I love nuclear movies. My dream is to win the lottery and do a podcast a week on a new nuclear movie and make it like Mystery Science Theater
Oh, nice.
3000 with the robots and go into details. And the stereotype from the 50s and 60s and 70s is that it's always the general, or in some of these movies, the surviving colonel who's with the president, who's gung ho to launch. You got to go now, Mr. President. If you don't, it shows weakness. And in reality, my experience has been it's the chairman, the commander of Stratcom, the president's military advisors who are very cautious. They know what happens if you unleash nuclear weapons, and they tend not to be overly aggressive or jump to conclusions about things like that. So again, it was sort of a familiar trope. I know why they did it, but I don't think it really did justice to the sort of dynamics that we have seen both in simulations and in real world crises that have emerged during the Cold War, where it was the Pentagon that often, not exclusively, but often was the voice of reason and caution.
Yeah, you mentioned technical details. One of the details that I enjoyed was the defense secretary forgetting to take himself off of mute during the video call.
Oh, well, look, let he without sin cast the first stone, right? There are going to be some issues there. At least he was reminded to put his ID in the holder so he could access the secure comms.
All right, you write, more must be done to create more reliable command and control systems, to ensure the ability of the government to survive an attack, to ensure leaders can talk to each other in crisis. I guess I have two questions in response to that. Number one, what can you say about, quote, more reliable command and control systems? And two, would we normal people, ever even find out about these sort of improvements?
I love that you consider yourself normies because, of course, you guys know a lot about this stuff. Command and control is like ice cream in your freezer. You can never have enough. You have to be thoughtful about how you do it. You can't just sort of lay on systems over systems. We know the more you do that, the more gaps and problems you can create. But what everybody agrees, even people on, from the pro-nuclear, let's deploy more crowd to the let's get rid of them all crowd, agree that we need to have a secure and effective command, control, and communication system to manage our nuclear weapons and our nuclear operations. You want the president to be able to talk with his advisors at any time, from anywhere, day or night, no matter where he is. We don't have those secure communications. They're vulnerabilities, they're gaps. When we did exercises in the Obama White House, we called them golf cart exercises because, you wanted to make sure the president, if he was out on the golf course, could pick up a phone and talk secure to anybody, anywhere. That takes time and effort and constantly has to be updated. So investments along those lines. But we know that we have gaps and vulnerabilities in our early warning system. We know we have gaps and vulnerabilities in our command and control because we mix nuclear and conventional are vulnerable to cyber space operations. And so are we sure that we're spending enough and both financially and enough time to make those as good as they can possibly be? I have my concerns, and I think we need to make sure that we're making those investments as aggressively as possible. Generally, what happens is the big, let's build a new missile programs get a lot of support, and the less sexy NC3 don't get as much profile. The answer to your second question, would normies know? Yeah, we would. I mean, we still have a transparent system. You wouldn't necessarily know the frequencies and, exactly how it operates, but you know how many SBIRS satellites we have in orbit. That's public record. You know how much we spend on nuclear command and control. That's in the budget. So yes, there is an ability to track and invest in these things and to make sure that they're accountable and properly resourced.
Now, Tom, I want to turn to you because you, of course, attended a screening of this movie with the director yesterday in Washington. How did that go?
Ben, it went great. As soon as I put my headphones in here, then I'm going to tell you all about it real quick. Ben, you got me?
I do. Oops, I do.
I got you.
Sorry, I was on mute. My own joke.
Look at that. See, we
There
did
you go.
nothing.
See, you got to leave that in.
Wow,
That's
that was
like
a
yeah.
that was a crazy cliffhanger that made me feel so stressed out. I was like, "Oh man, I derailed this whole podcast." Hold on.
I'm going back on mute.
All right, here we go. Yeah, it was a really cool experience. It was my first time ever attending a screening at the Navy War Memorial Theater in DC, which is beautiful. But it was, I think what was really insightful and gets to John's point here is there was an interview, a Q&A session with Catherine Bigelow, as well as, someone who was a technical advisor on the film, and that was Mr. Dan Karbler. Dan Karbler, he was the, former commander of Army Space and Missile Defense Command, and he was the former chief of staff for STRATCOM. And his insights were really valuable because it showed how much attention to detail that he wanted to put in the film there, including, that mention that you made, Ben, about the Zoom call, that kind of that teleconference there. He talked about how much detail went into that, about that, the teeing up of, the intros and who would be on the call and how they would set that up. There's obviously some points there that John made that, getting people connected to that call and such, kind of showcase some of the technical stresses there. But that was all pretty accurate from his experience. And it was cool hearing, how much he put into that film in terms of his personal experience, as well as his experience being around, strategic command there. Obviously, so many people talk about the ending of this movie, and it was cool getting to be in a theater. The first time I saw this film, I was just at home on my couch streaming it on Netflix. But being in a theater with people, the audible gasps at the end of the movie of not having closure. It was cool seeing that reaction in a crowded room. It was also fun because there were so many DC insiders and journalists there that laughed at very relatable parts of the film, whether it was picking up Sweet Green for the office at the FEMA offices there. There was kind of an audible laugh to that, or taking the Zoom call on the run as you're getting out of a Lyft or an Uber. Many of those things felt very relatable to people within the Beltway. So it was cool seeing some reactions to that. But I think overall, one of the parts here was seeing that ending live and seeing the reaction to it. Catherine Bigelow got into some of the explanation there. The first question she was asked was, why that ending choice? And, I think it was really interesting that she pointed to this idea that, there's no one to point a finger at the end of this film, right? And the kind of enemy, if you will, is the system that exists where nuclear missiles are everywhere, hence the House of Dynamite. And it was cool hearing her kind of explain that editorial and directorial choice at the end there.
Yeah, it was an interesting choice that I kind of began anticipating about halfway through the movie. I was thinking, I'm probably not going to have a resolution. But I hadn't read much of anything at all up to that point. All right, Patrick, what are you still left pondering after this movie?
So in terms of questions that John might be able to take a crack at, as we know, the kind of one of the main sort of technological dramatic thrusts is the idea that there could be a single rogue missile launch, and the ground-based mid-course defense system, which is what we have, that is supposed to intercept these things, might have a sort of catastrophic failure. And then, because now we're at a new era of potential global nuclear proliferation, if we don't do a few things right, then this could set off a sort of catastrophic chain reaction, and that's how you get this weird dramatic moment of decision. But John, as you and I know, the whole shooting a bullet with a bullet is a way to characterize the intercept capabilities of our current ground-based mid-course defense interceptors in Alaska and California. If I write that, I'll get a call from a half dozen current and former retirees that will scream at me and say, it's not 50%, it's at least up to 61. But it's not great, Yeah. But it was specifically designed for North Korea and Iran, a singular missile type. And so the idea is, if there's a singular missile, then you just continue to fire, you would fire interceptors at it in order to intercept. It's not designed for a massive armory like the former Soviet Union, Russia, or China. So your thoughts on this? Is it fair to ground-based mid-course defense? And if you were watching this and you were going to then take something to, as a lobbyist to Capitol Hill and say, see, do you see this movie? This is what we need to fix. What would be like your thoughts on it?
Yeah. First of all, I think missile defense can defend itself. It's not a question of whether it's a vulnerable victim here, right? It doesn't need defending. Um, Look, the United States has been interested in missile defense since the 1950s. The original nuclear theorists understood that there would be a relationship between offense and defense as soon as ballistic missiles were developed. And, Great Britain had tried to develop defenses against, V1 and V2 rockets. And it in warfare, defense can outlast and be more effective than offense, right? The traditional 3-to-1 ratio. But in missile defense, offense is always, always going to be cheaper than defense. And so missile defense can only be effective in very limited situations. And we've seen this in Israel, where you have a very limited area and the level of tolerance for damage is extremely, extremely low. The bar has to be set very high. But for a country like the United States to defend itself against ballistic missile threats is simply infeasible. So the question is, why do we have missile defense and what is it for? And you point out this was designed not to counter large scale strategic attack. That's what deterrence is for. What it can do potentially is defend against the one-offs or the limited strikes. And that's why we have 44 interceptors. But the reality is it's still really hard. This is not being unfair or fair to missile defense. It's just trying to hit a very high moving object in outer space with another high moving, object is difficult, and we have not yet mastered it. So, there are very smart people that say might be 50, 60%. There are other really smart people who say because we've tested only under ideal circumstances, the real world performance might be much lower than that. What I found really puzzling was the Pentagon, in a memo that was covered by some media outlets.
Yep. Go ahead. Preach.
Complained about the movie because our missile defense is 100% effective. At which point you would say, okay, great, we don't need to invest any more money in research and development. Let's just keep buying the same GBIs we have now, and Golden Dome is unnecessary. So, what is it? Do we need to spend hundreds of billions or trillions of dollars on Golden Dome, or is missile defense effective? And the reality is, even if we were to develop much better missile defenses, our adversaries are building decoys. Our adversaries are building hyperglide maneuverable reentry vehicles. They're building nuclear-powered, nuclear-tipped cruise missiles, which can evade missile defenses, and underwater torpedoes. So even if you build the best missile defense money can buy, you're still vulnerable to nuclear weapons. What we see is the political value of saying we're investing to defend the United States. Both parties are on board with that. The question is, are we actually getting good value for our money? And that's where I think having a much more transparent and robust testing and evaluation program for missile defenses is long overdue.
I want to just tack on that real quick, because this incident where the Pentagon sent out a memo claiming that the statistical representation of ground-based mid-course defense as being like a bullet in a bullet, that was absolutely unfair and that we're 100% effective despite the presence of a great deal of on-the-record commentary, congressional reporting, public testimony, and just known fact that suggests, no, it's about like this. This is why you have this sort of layered defense, and which is why you have diplomacy and non-proliferation at the State Department. It's not true. And that echoes back to a previous kind of weird event that happened when the Pentagon insisted that the destruction of the Iranian nuclear capability was absolute and total, even though it was actually a successful strike that probably set down or set back Iran's ability to produce a nuclear weapon. But because they were completely reliant on the way, like literally Donald Trump decided to characterize it, and they went to the mat for it, it kind of broke with credibility. And so without me like sort of kvetching too much about it, what role is clear communication that is credible in the broader context of nuclear deterrence? And how do you see that a little bit in this movie?
Yeah. It's a great point, and Patrick, we can go back to Sean Spicer and the first inauguration for Donald Trump, right? He said it was the biggest ever, and people saw the pictures, and Sean Spicer to go back out on the podium and justify what the president said. So, I think we see the way the entire administration operates, and once the president sets the line, we'll be onto them who decides not to back them up. Um, and this really gets to the title of the movie and one of the core issues that nuclear experts have wrestled with and continue to wrestle with, which is the entire construct of the nuclear age is built on deterrence. It- Nobody would be insane, crazy, deranged, misguided enough to launch an attack on the United States, nor would the United States be insane enough to launch a nuclear attack on Russia or China, because those countries have sufficient numbers of nuclear weapons of the kinds capable of surviving a first strike and imposing massive, unprecedented historical damage on the country that attacked first. Um, mutually assured destruction. And the problem with mutually assured destruction is it assumes that all of your actors are rational and that people get the decisions right all the time. And I wrote about this in the piece. We've had plenty of episodes where we think we're under attack and we're not. And the Russians have had the same. We have numerous episodes where we have a conventional conflict and it's starting to spiral out of control, and people get concerned that a nuclear attack is imminent and they take steps, which then in turn convince our adversary that we're actually preparing a nuclear strike and we have to both climb down. And so the problem, the house of dynamite, the spark in that is the assumption that we're always going to get it right. And the story that I tell, and this is in a great book by Fred Kaplan, The Bomb, we did a simulation with President Obama in 2016 where we were debating and discussing nuclear policy. And one of the people in the room said, Mr. President, this is our strategy. We just have to acknowledge it. This is insane. And the president just looked at him and said, let's stipulate that all of this is insane. What are we going to do about it in our remaining year in office, right? I mean, they know the problem, or when the problem is explained to them, they get it, but nobody really feels empowered or that they have the time to make the strategic decisions to get out of the house of dynamite. And that's the world that we've lived in. And as you pointed out, rightly, the world we're increasingly going to live in as nuclear weapons become more central to global politics over the next 10, 20 years.
John, I wanted to ask a question because you brought up, I think, a really important point, and that's the Pentagon pushing back on what I believe is a pretty generous statistic that's, mentioned in the film about the, ground-based interceptors and their success rates. And I think you bring up a good point that if they are 100% successful, then what is the need for Golden Dome? What is the need for a more robust system? And I was curious if you could talk at all about how the message of this film lands for supporters of Golden Dome. If you're watching this film, are you doubling down on Golden Dome and noting that, the statistics, well, what I understand are pretty generous from, what the technical advisor said yesterday during the screening, and from the reports out there, of course, that I think some of the reports out there, like from the American Physical Society, put it at around 55% for the success rate of those weapons. I'm curious, space-based interceptors are a much harder equation to crack, right? And that almost feels like, hitting a bullet with a bullet while riding, on horseback in a hurricane, right? Like it feels like a much more complicated equation to crack. So I'm curious how you feel that Golden Dome plays into the equation of the message of this film.
Yeah. I've got my cynical answer and then I've got my analytical answer. The cynical answer is, I've watched now nuclear movies on TV and in the theaters have impact on presidents and the public. The Day After, Special Report in the 1970s, 1980s are well documented to have influenced both Ronald Reagan and the public to really focus in on the danger of nuclear war and to do something about it. We're well past that stage. We are inundated with information, I was half joking about my desire to have a video blog. I've got a list of about 175 movies with nuclear weapons in them, and they have less and less impact over time. Oppenheimer didn't really change the needle. I wish that everybody would see House of Dynamite, and I wish that it would drive the political narrative, but I really don't see it having an impact on the Golden Dome debate to the extent that there is one. And quite, you watch even more closely than I do the dynamics and armed services committees in the Pentagon and procurement. We're going to spend a huge amount of money on Golden Dome. Apparently, there's no limit to the amount of money the Pentagon can spend, and this is one of the protected priorities. The reality is that for the many, many decades and the hundreds of billions of dollars that the United States has spent on missile defense, the original dream that Ronald Reagan had about brilliant pebbles and an astrodome, a superdome in space that would protect us, is simply infeasible. You need to have tens of thousands of interceptors orbiting the Earth. And even if, and there's a possibility that these interceptors might have an easier shot at an incoming ballistic missile because they don't have to travel through the atmosphere to get there. They can hit it in space. Once it's effective against the one missile, it then leaves a hole in the network that is predictable and our adversary can shoot through. So it's effective for the first missile, but not the second or the third or the 100th. So, that's not going to change the fact that we're going to spend a lot of money on these feasibility studies, and it may actually improve a number of related technologies around regional missile defense, point defense, space operations. I'm not saying it's not without some merit, but we haven't had an informed debate about whether missile defense works and is worth it since SDI. And I think it's time for one, but I don't know how we get from here to there.
And a follow up on that, John, I think you brought up a good point about public education. And in the wake of this film, Senator Ed Markey, Democrat from Massachusetts, he wrote a letter, to the Pentagon about this movie and said the public needs accurate information, specifically when it comes to the GMD system and, if it's going to provide effective protection. Do you feel like just by having the conversation, this brings forward enough questions, not about the existing system, but also about future systems, right? I mean, if you're someone who's not plugged into this community like we are, do you feel like it raises enough concerns? I mean, clearly enough for a senator to write a letter saying, hey, the public needs more info on this.
Yeah. I work at the Federation of American Scientists. We've built our entire 80-year career on pushing to end government secrecy and promote transparency and accountability. So absolutely, it is helpful for anything that sparks congressional engagement, attention. Senator Markey is a long engaged expert on nuclear and missile defense issues, so I think this gave him a useful hook. What I'd like to see is, of course, the much broader bipartisan engagement on this issue. The reality is we haven't had a fully transparent program testing and evaluation program on missile defense since the 1980s. There were very critical reports that were put out when Phil Coyle was the head of testing and evaluation for strategic programs in the Pentagon. And they were so critical that they decided, you know what, we're not going to share any more information with the public because they are deemed classified. And this is spreading throughout the government. For example, just the cost of the B-21 strategic bomber was classified when John McCain was still alive and in the Senate because he wanted to protect it from political scrutiny. This is an invasive problem and one that I don't think serves the debate. And I'm glad the movie has sparked it. And I hope that there's more of it.
So I think that one of the things that sort of occurs to me when watching this movie that I wanted to talk on is the point that you just made, which is that systems, like you can spend a lot of money on systems for missile defense, and that can actually have a lot of value in terms of your diplomatic effort to create deterrence, to create understanding with your nuclear counterparty. In the Cold War era, there was one, and now there's like two at a strategic level, and potentially others. But that is, the systems are a big part of that discussion. But ultimately, these decisions come down to people and people in policy. And I think there's a lot of folks that sort of don't understand all of the other elements of U.S. military posture, for instance, that go into helping to create a world where there are a number of entities, of countries that have nuclear weapons is relatively limited, like the entire nuclear non-proliferation regime that exists. And I wonder if you could comment a little bit on the state that it's in, because kind of the premise of this movie is that there is a nuclear missile launch and no one knows exactly where it's from. And that aspect of it, I think, is becoming a more and more sort of credible concern, just because the number of potential nuclear armed states might rise really quickly in the next few years if non-proliferation efforts just sort of fall apart. And there's a lot of different ways it could fall apart. So I wanted to know if you could, Tom, what your thoughts were on that.
Sure, happy to, Patrick, and it's a great question, so thanks for it. And I'll put this tongue in cheek. Me and my colleagues did a long series for a publication that won't be named, but was involved in Watergate and helped bring down President Nixon over the summer about the next nuclear age and why we have to worry about nuclear weapons again, and the countries that are both pursuing them or thinking about pursuing them. And we are in an environment where nuclear weapons in the hands of the United States and Russia and China and North Korea and others are becoming more seen as more useful, both politically and potentially even militarily, and where confidence in the United States amongst our allies is shrinking. And that is leading to debates in Europe and Asia about the need for them to develop their own nuclear capabilities if the United States can't be relied upon. The nonproliferation system has been successful in part because of our efforts to constrain the bad guys, quote unquote. But really, where it's had success is in restraining our friends from pursuing nuclear weapons, because when they, or if they do so, it makes the world a more dangerous place and makes it harder for the United States to effectively manage those alliances. You're probably familiar with the big controversy earlier last year. Now Under Secretary of Defense Bridge Colby was over in Japan and South Korea and openly advocated for our South Korean allies to build nuclear weapons. You build nukes, he said, and you take care of North Korea, that will free us up to focus on China. And he had to quickly recant those arguments because, of course, that's not U.S. policy, and it's also really reckless and dangerous. So the concern is that we will see more countries pursue nuclear weapons, that will not only complicate our alliance system, but will create these risks that you point out, that while we're very good at tracking ballistic missiles when they're launched from known sites, we're a little bit less solid when they come from mobile missiles. But a country like North Korea that's developing submarine launched ballistic missile capabilities makes it very hard for attribution. If they launch from the Pacific, is that a Chinese sub or a North Korean sub? And against whom do we respond? Those are then become open questions, which really undermine the basis of deterrence. And so one of the reasons the U.S. has worked tirelessly for decades and decades, since before we were all born, to prevent the wider spread of nuclear weapons is normies can figure out that if the world is filled with nuclear weapons, it's a much more dangerous place, and it's harder to rely on basic deterrence to keep the peace.
Yeah, just like a quick, fun, weird statistic on that, because a lot of people don't exactly understand why the U.S. military, like why there was a Department of Defense in the first place, like the size of U.S. foreign military posture all around the world. There's like 80 different countries where the U.S. has a foreign military base. And that's a lot of money. That's school buses and healthcare and things. Of those 80 countries, where the U.S. has a foreign, and John, please correct me if I'm wrong, but this is my understanding. Of those 80 countries where the U.S. has a foreign military base, there is only one that has its own nuclear weapons program, and that's the UK. And that sort of gives you a sense of like the value of just having a really good military to military partnership, like an umbrella agreement in terms of preventing massive proliferation. And so when we talk about the future of force posture and pulling people out of South Korea, pulling people out of Germany, it's very expensive to keep them there, et cetera. This is maybe part of the consideration. It's this massive network of stability that we sort of fail to appreciate, and now it's perhaps more vulnerable than ever.
Yeah. Patrick, I've spent a lot of time working on these issues, and I'd never thought of that statistic. It's a great one. I'm going to steal it, so thank you. Again, tongue in cheek, I'll steal from the Pentagon, where they like to say that if you think deterrence is expensive, try nuclear war, right? Well, if you think that deploying troops in foreign countries and our allies to keep them non-nuclear is expensive, wait until you see Germany, Poland, Finland, South Korea, Japan with nuclear weapons. That's going to be much more expensive, and it will make the world much harder for the United States to influence and, for lack of a better term, have leverage over. Of all the things that I've pointed to as counterproductive under this administration, applying massive tariffs to our close allies in Europe and East Asia while we're trying to manage our defense relationships with them and get them to buy American defense equipment is nonsensical. And they see that, and it erodes the ability of the United States to maintain our alliance system, which has been an incredibly effective tool for us.
Yeah, yeah. This was something that when I covered this a couple months ago and I talked to people about it, there was a sense, great concern that when you have, for instance, South Korea is generally like the closest if they were going to have a breakout to having something that would be testable. But once you have one potential new nuclear weapons program, the entire regime falls apart, and you get a chain reaction where then Poland has to consider its place under the French nuclear umbrella, and then you have countries all around the world are in a sort of mad scramble. And China and Russia are not going to be really accommodating to a 9 to 2 year breakout window for a country that's in their perceived orbits to attempt to develop nuclear weapons. Things get really chaotic really quickly. And it was what I was told by all these people that I interviewed for this thing a couple of weeks ago. It's just very scary.
There is the risk of these proliferation cascades. There's been a lot of work done on it over the years. And every time a country has gotten nuclear weapons, another country has then gotten nuclear weapons in response to them or pursuit of programs. So there are these chains. We have seen the non-proliferation system be very resilient, in part because countries and leaders do understand that a widely proliferated world is dangerous for everybody. And so you do see when countries pursue these capabilities, a general response, whether it be sanctions or diplomacy or engagement, whatever it happens to be. Now, I think we are at a crossroads where, because the United States is moving away from its traditional leadership in that system, it's harder to sustain it. And we could see a breakdown. I wouldn't discount it. But, I'm an optimist. I've worked on arms control a lot, so we tend to be fairly hopeful. And this is a question of political will. If we can actually do the net assessment and the cost benefit analysis, we come out in the right place. I just hope that there's time to address these challenges before it's too late.
A lot of people are right now looking at different ways that artificial intelligence could help inform a better understanding, kind of specifically of like command and control, and elucidate new probabilities about something, a launch, a bunch of radioactive material, a sudden spike in detected energy levels from one place or another, just create a lot of transparency and potentially streamlining communications to remove the possibility of human error. And there's some folks that obviously no one thinks that there should be automatic, like artificial intelligence launched nuclear war. There's some people who think that you can remove that chaotic human emotional element from it. There's other folks that you just point to war games, which is great. And I'd love to know where war games falls on your list, because I don't think they actually have a nuclear weapon like detonation or anything. But it's one of my favorite like artificial intelligence movies. And there's some people that say like, no, you're going to create a great big potential for a blind spot in terms of command and control, because you're trusting machine intelligence that you don't fully understand. And I just wanted to know your thoughts on where you land on that, and how is the best way to incorporate AI into nuclear command and control and also non-proliferation.
Yeah. Well, let me start at the most important thing. I got into this field in part because I saw war games as a child, and I was sure I was going to end up married to Ali Sheedy. I ended up marrying even better than that, of course, but it's a great movie and it's worth watching. It holds up pretty well, actually. So we're actually have been engaged for the last year at the Federation on an in-depth research program on AI and catastrophic risk, including nuclear, chemical, biological risk and programs. And so have done a deep dive on the question of AI and nuclear command and control. What we basically have boiled down to is the following. There are a number of areas where AI can be applied into the nuclear complex with almost no risk. And one good standard that my colleague Herb Lynn out at Stanford has put forward is saying that, if AI is being used in the commercial sector to good effect, then there's no real reason it couldn't be applied into the nuclear enterprise with the same benefits. Chains of logistics for equipment and materiel, Personnel reliability detection. Do you have a problem with people and, instead of using humans to go through bank records, can you use AI to do assessments on the reliability of personnel? Training and simulations can be an effective area where AI can be applied. But when it comes to anything that influences the decisions of human beings when it comes to nuclear assessments and nuclear use, I am very worried, and I think with good reason, for the use of AI. So, for example, we already use large language models to detect and evaluate the missile tracks that we detect through our early warning system and to evaluate and alert our watch officers, are they dealing with an incoming missile to the United States or not? That missile track in the movie House of Dynamite was scrubbed by a large language model. That's how we know immediately that it's headed, or almost immediately, that it's headed to the United States, because we can project and we know the characteristics of missiles because we plugged in that data. But even then, we have a system which says there has to be dual phenomenology. You can't just rely on the AI large language model outcome to determine a course of action. There has to be a second human tracked stream. And I've heard the arguments, and there are actually people, Patrick, that advocate we need to have an AI dead hand. We need to have what Russia had, and we need to have automation. I tend to be very worried about those arguments.
We can call it the doomsday machine.
That's right. We cannot allow a doomsday gap. I think use of nuclear weapons is the most important and potentially the most catastrophic decision that a president can ever make. And the three presidents that I've spoken to about this agree. It is too important to delegate to anybody. We don't delegate nuclear launch authority to generals or secretaries of defense. It's in the hands of the president. And the same should be true about the information that goes up and down the chain to the president, that has to be in the hands of human beings, not machines. Now, there's going to be red lines, and there's going to be sort of gray zones, and we're not yet near the gray zone. But what worries me above all is currently, to the best of our knowledge, there is no standing guidance or regulation in the Pentagon for whether and how large language models can be integrated into nuclear command and control systems. It is a completely ad hoc decision-making process. And you cover the Pentagon, you know what this Pentagon's like. Do we really believe that those systems are going to be evaluated at the highest level in a very objective manner? I know the technocrats and bureaucrats are very conservative when it comes to what new technologies will be applied, but we're in a very uncertain time, and I don't know how to evaluate those risks these days.
Yeah, no, that's a very good question, because a novice person using ChatGPT finds that it flatters them at every opportunity. It's designed to do that because that has a high user response. But within the broader military construct, when you talk to actual operators, they're very interested in incorporating AI into operations, so long as it's part of this kind of broad campaign where individual operators are involved in the creation of the AI, where it's a long-term relationship. But you can't just use it to skip out of work the way they sort of think conventionally. You have to put a lot of work into it, and then you can scale up the aspects of your job that can be improved through the use of automation that you have in many ways helped to create through your interaction with a foundation model. And I'm very pleased and continually reassured that is the way that the United States continues to approach AI within military concepts of operation. It's a little bit different with Russia and China, but depending on how quickly war or a combat situation or a scenario is developing, all of that might go out the window. But if you take the time now to make sure that that's kind of the relationship everyone has with any AI that they use, then that's great. But to your point, that's kind of on that ground infantry sort of drone guy level, in terms of broader constructs of policy and things like that. No one has given that any thought yet. It's kind of free for all.
Yeah, and all of this gets down to, I think we all understand this, and your listeners hopefully do as well. All of this gets down to speed, right? There's a real advantage on the battlefield for speed of knowledge, transfer, and action. The United States has tremendous advantages there, and we should seek to exploit them. But if what you're really worried about is speed when it comes to making nuclear weapons decisions, then you haven't done the hard work of managing your arsenal and your processes. In the Obama administration, we worked very hard to create space and time for the president to have more decision space and more time so we wouldn't have to speed up the process. Creating situations so we don't have to rely on launch on warning, investing in continuity of operations and continuity of government so that there could be a line of succession so the president didn't have to make snap decisions in 2 minutes about whether to launch all of our nuclear weapons or not. And I've worked with and talked with many members of both the civilian and military control at Stratcom who believe we've made great progress in that area. AI is advocated in the nuclear space as something to save time. And what I would like to see is that potential benefit evaluated against all the other ways we can buy time for our leadership that don't introduce as many risks. And I don't think we're doing that today. And I think that has to be an essential component.
You have this list. You have this list of movies, and I want to know how they stack up in terms of what people, not necessarily your favorite of all time, but what's the one that people should totally watch now? And isn't it not Dr. Strangelove?
If they haven't seen Dr. Strangelove, they should go and get it right away. But I've got a good tidbit that even you, as a deep nuclear honorary geek, probably don't know. Stanley Kubrick had a partner that he did a bunch of movies with leading up to Dr. Strangelove that got a lot of accolades. And they had a falling out over how to make a movie on nuclear weapons. Kubrick wanted to do sort of a black comedy, and his partner wanted to do a sort of a docudrama. And so Dr. Strangelove is a great movie, but it should be partnered with a terrific movie called The Bedford Incident with Richard Widmark and Sidney Poitier. It's really good. It's very tense. It's a combination of Moby Dick and War Games without the humor. But Strangelove's still at the top of the pinnacle. But I highly recommend Bedford Incident.
Interesting.
Bedford Incident. I will. I've not seen this. I will. That's fantastic.
Worth the price of admission to the podcast.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, I've never even heard of that. I was expecting a different answer. I appreciate that. All right, Jon Wolfsthal is the director of global risk at the Federation of American Scientists. You can read his essay on the recent movie A House of Dynamite at defenseone.com. Jon, thanks so much for speaking with us. I know we all really appreciate it.
My pleasure.
Yeah, thanks, John. Yeah, thanks.
No worries.
Well, that's it for us this episode. Thanks for listening, and until next time.